sitting here, more people, and I only see my brothers from my best second continent. I consider myself half African. My son is African. My great-grandfather was a lady African who was free from slavery because she was born after a law. And as you know, Brazil, we are half African and half many other races. And I feel happy to be here to share with you some of my thoughts concerning Africa and the development in Africa, educational and missiological. As you know, I've been for 18 years in several countries in Africa, and I really appreciate the presentations last night here, and also your comments this morning here are really important, and they contribute a lot for the thought of this transition that Africa is going through. I appreciate what the missionaries have done to my country and to South America. If it was not because of them, South America wouldn't be there today. Our South America division, Peru, Brazil, and other countries that are growing so fast. There was a moment of transition, and that transition was healthy, and today the church is taking care of itself. And I believe that Africa is going through that transition since a few, maybe 20 years, when missionaries are leaving to be place for the leadership of local and leaders who are more able to understand the perspectives of local church and make a healthy growth. It's also important to understand that Africa is not a country, right? Africa is hundreds of countries. You speak thousands of languages, and you are very different. It's not like Peru, South America, or some countries in South America where we only have a few languages speaking. So this morning I'd like to share with you a few images of Niger, just to put you in context of Niger, where I worked for 7 years. We had 3 schools managed by ADRA, and those schools had about 2,000 pupils and students, and we had to find strategies to teach without breaking their traditions, without breaking their pride of being Nigerians, and that's a big challenge. The word here is context. So let's, I think I have, is there another microphone here? Maybe you can use this one. Yeah, give me here, please. Thank you, Elias. Okay, I hope this thing will play. Some sound here. Oh yes, okay. That's better. Okay, well, let's see if sound comes out. Yes, okay, it's about 30 seconds. Pictures are taken about 15 years ago. is a little bit of Niger, the Niger that I know, that I love, where my son was born, and where we have left many brothers and sisters who we miss a lot. And this presentation is about the effective cross-cultural communication of the gospel, a case study in Niger. So while we were there, there was a group of missionaries coming to work in that country. These missionaries, they are from many different evangelical agencies of mission. And I decided to, last year, the year before and last year, to have a survey concerning their skills as educators, as missionaries, as teachers, because they were basically there to work as teachers and also as health agents in different villages and communities. And I believe this research is meaningful for the Adventist education in Africa, as it provides important factors, implications, statistics, and recommendations for an efficient cross-cultural communication in our educational institution, be it a vocational training offered by ADRA or a postgraduate study in higher education institutions. These missionaries, they worked in Niger between the years 2003 and 2013. There were more than 14 missionaries, most of them from Brazil, South America, and because of this impact that they caused in Niger, it deserves missiological research, as they have changed many aspects of Niger educational system. You know, one of the first words we learn when we go to Niger is the word fofo. The word fofo means, I've shared with some friends, means the word cute, nice, or someone who is lovely, you know? I don't know if anybody knows this language, German. German is a language speaking in the West Africa, Songhai language. And in Portuguese, that word, as I said, means this, you know, when you only use that word to speak to someone who you really love, someone who is lovely, cute. And it can be even a romantic word, you know, to say to your wife, fofo, fofa. But that word in Niger means hi. It can be hi or also goodbye. So every time you see someone, you're going to say fofo. When you say goodbye, you say fofo. So the first Sabbath in that church, in the Niger Niamey church, I remember when the pastor came to me and he said, that's how we greet here, fofo. You can greet the members. So I learned that word, that was the first word I learned, and then he grabbed my hands and we were walking around hand by hand. Well, in Brazil, men never walk, you know, around handing with the hands, you know, with another man. And my wife was looking at me and laughing at me when I looked at the pastor, and he then changed the position. He started grabbing my hands like this, with little fingers, no? And I felt really uncomfortable. You know, we never do like this, even with parents, fathers, or brothers. Men with men never hold hands like that. It was my first Sabbath in that church. And I was uncomfortable with that situation. Eventually I realized that others were also walking that way. And look to someone who is high. You know, the Nigerian people, they are tall. Look to someone who is big and tall, and use a word that you only use for women, fofo, and then grab the hands and go walking around. It's quite a challenge. So it's a challenge when you leave a place to go to another place, and then you want to help people to grow without understanding their values, their forms, meanings of the forms. It's a big challenge to be an educator or a missionary if you live here and go anywhere else. I believe that you are here living in another context and you know what I'm talking about. In the 21st century, we live a world full of globalization everywhere. And it has increased the importance of international public relations and requires understanding of cross-cultural communication for organizations of all types. Not only missions, but NGOs, organizations, and even volunteers. They need to understand those principles. During the 7 years that I lived in Niger, I have learned that successful cross-cultural communication is the ability to effectively form, nurture, and improve relationships with members of a culture different from mine. It's based on knowledge of many factors, such as the other's cultures, values, perceptions, manners, social structure, and decision-making practices, and the understanding of how members of the group communicate verbally, non-verbally, in person, in writing, and in various business and social contexts, to name but a few. According to Jones, like speaking a foreign language or riding a bicycle, cross-cultural communication involves a skill component that may best be learned and mastered through instruction and practice. Simply reading about it is not enough. Therefore, the problem here is that communicating across culture is challenged. Each culture has sets of rules that its members take for granted. Few of us are aware of our own cultural biases because cultural imprinting begins at a very early age. While some of the culture's knowledge, rules, beliefs, values, phobias, and anxieties are taught explicitly, most of the information is absorbed subconsciously. Ignorance of context usually leads to misunderstanding and conflicts. Living in a different cultural context demands patience to learn the obvious meanings and the connotative meanings in the process of communication. Misunderstandings in cross-cultural communication may lead new converts to a religious experience mixed up with syncretistic religious practices or double allegiance. Therefore, it can be problematic when an individual from a low context culture background communicates to individuals of high context culture background. It can be far worse when individuals belonging to the different high context cultures try to communicate as codes, gestures, symbols, and feelings may not be expressed similarly and with the same meaning. According to Winter and Horton, Brazil is the first in number of missionaries sent from Latin America. The increasing number of Brazilian missionaries living in West Africa, especially in Niger, has caused a lost impact, but how effective has been their cross-cultural communication? How difficult it is to become a skilled cross-cultural communicator? Since the goal of missionary is to bring transformation through the gospel, it is crucial to understand principles that will communicate a message that is coherent and contextually meaningful. This research was aimed to find biblical and missiological principles and strategies for successful contextualized cross-cultural communication of the gospel for missionaries from Brazil working in Niger. As I said before, the principles apply for any other context. Therefore, in the Old Testament times, God communicates with Abraham and the Jewish people in an understandable way, adapted to the culture which is close to animism, but communicates new information by changing the meaning of the forms and creating new symbols. A few examples are the name of God, which is changed from Elohim to Yahweh, the alliances, also the non-sacrifice of children, the ark inside of the Holy of the Holies, the laws concerning sacrificial ritual, the code of holiness. God used mediators like Moses and the prophets. The prophets communicate in images like funeral laments, lamentations, proverbs, puzzles, symbolic names, symbolic acts, and metaphors. These few examples clearly demonstrate that God intentionally communicates by means of the three levels of cross-cultural communication, which is 1, cognitive level, understanding words, concepts, and its implicit meaning. B, affective level, understanding of feelings, aesthetics, and relationship present in the process. And C, evaluative level, understanding of the judgmental dimensions, which is unconscious. These three levels of communication are indispensable in order to avoid the danger of giving a greater weight to cultural context and not to the revelation of God, which produces syncretism as consequence. We also find in the New Testament many ways how God communicated with us by non-verbal and verbal means. Therefore, cross-cultural communication in literature review is also very important to see how people who study cross-cultural communication understand the principles of it. Charles Kraft, he preferred a term called appropriate Christianity, and the critical, the intentionally contextualization presented by other scholars like Hibbert, he calls it a critical contextualization, and he gives some steps on how to do that. The first steps for critical contextualization suggested by Hibbert is exegesis of the culture. It is critical, non-judgmental, sympathetic, and search for deeper meanings, trying to find hooks upon which to hang the gospel or building bridges. B, exegesis and application of the Bible. It is a process of taking strengths and weaknesses into account. Also, critical response and self-applications. Locals are always best able to criticize their customs and apply the Bible meaning, while the leaders must allow them to have ownership of their decisions and live with it. Now, we have to consider also the fact of some places have a high context and other places having low context culture. Basically, Hall defines it, he systematizes cultural differences in the use of languages and context in communication. He identifies as low context any communication that occurs mostly through language, and high context communication that occurs in ways other than through language. In high context culture, communication is high context, is less verbally explicit, and information is familiar and often not written. It has more internalized understandings for the message communicated and multiple cross-cutting ties and intersection with others. Knowledge is situational, especially based on long-term relationship. It has strong boundaries: who is accepted as belonging versus who is considered an outsider. Now, high context and low context, if we put them together, people from different cultural contexts, they can perceive each other in many different ways. And I'd like to show you some figures, some image comparisons here. For instance, here, high context people, when they communicate, they believe they are polite, they are respectful, they integrate by similarities, and they are not directed. While people in low context communication, they believe they are open, they are true, they integrate by authenticity, and they are directed. Now, high context people claims that low context people, they are impolite, they cannot read between the lines, they are naive, they have no self-discipline, and they are too fast. While low context claims that high context people, they are hiding information, they are not trustable, they are arrogant, and they are too formal and too slow. So we have, after having all these surveys, we have seen that some areas of strength of missionaries is that they have a positive cultural self-image. They are able to express themselves in contextualization forms. They are cross-cultural active listeners. They are able to open up and be correspondent. They are able to comfortably deal with cultural differences. Another result of this research, this survey, is that this thing is passing by. How can I stop this? Okay, so the cross-cultural communication analysis of the missionaries as individuals show that they have a superior level of communication, 55% of them, and satisfactory, only 62%, most of them, they have a satisfactory level of communication, while only 12% are tolerable. So not all of them, they were good communicators. And especially on the level of missiological communication, they had a very high level. It's interesting to note that when they were working as group, for any other project, they would communicate much better than communicating individually. Therefore, teaching new concepts and ideas in cross-cultural context demands strategic methods, like the need to contextualize the message critically in order to avoid syncretism and double allegiance. Some recommendations. Why are you going like this? Let me go back here. A few recommendations before the conclusion. First of all, cross-cultural communication needs one second, I need to just take off this effect from here. Okay, let's see if it works. So, first recommendation is, sorry for that. Cross-cultural communication needs to be focused. Okay, let's try this way now. No effects. Yes. Okay. I'll just go on like this. Cross-cultural communication needs to be focused. Cross-cultural communication needs to be liquid. Cross-cultural communication needs to be contextualized in their message. And number 4, the chronological method of communication of the gospel proves to be the most effective system to transmit a meaningful and contextualized message. In conclusion, and I'm sorry I didn't have enough time to go through this, communication involves the perception, interpretation, and evaluation of a person's behavior. All 3 levels of communication are dependent on a person's cultural background, which determines the meaning attached to a specific behavior. First, context plays a really important role in the cross-cultural communication, and a clear understanding of the differences within contexts is quite necessary. Second, communication involves the perception, interpretation, and evaluation of a person's behavior. All 3 levels of communication are dependent on a person's cultural background, which determines the meaning attached to a specific behavior. Third, it was shown that perception is based on cognitive, affective, and evaluative patterns, which can be learned until it becomes consistent, accurate, and most importantly, culturally adjusted. Fourth, this leads to the conclusion that 2 people from different cultures will not only communicate in different ways, but also perceive a situation differently. The chronological teaching of the Bible is the best method used for evangelism, discipleship, and church planting in high-context cultures like Niger, since it provides the necessary background for pre-literate people with no previous exposure to Christianity who need to understand the concepts that lead up to the gospel and the coming of Christ.